Very welcome to the Herland Report.
Thank you, thank you.
Dr. Reginald Davis.
Yes.
You are a great lecturer here in America. You have been a professor at several universities. You are a great author of many books.
Yes, yes.
And you are the pastor of one of the oldest churches in America.
Right.
The First Baptist Church in Virginia. And we're here speaking about the family and what happened to America.
Yes.
And one of your books, From Wall Street to Main Street, addresses this issue.
Right.
And you kind of put out the notion that we are like the Roman Empire at the last days before the fall. What do you mean by that?
Well, when one looks at the rise and decline of the Roman Empire, you had a decline in morality. You had a decline in values. You had an overreach of military installations. You had economic problems. You had a dependence on cheap labor. You had a division in the government. And then you had greed on top of that. So when we begin to look at what is happening in America and parallel that to the rise and decline of the Roman Empire, we say that the parallels are very frightening. So I wrote this book to sound an alarm, to say that if we don't get on another trajectory, that we're going to experience the same thing as the Roman Empire. And so when you look at Wall Street, for instance, who made deals and put this country in a financial crisis, a housing crisis, and all of these executives, no one was held accountable for that. In fact, the government stepped in and assisted them, but left Main Street holding the bag. So when you see that kind of aristocracy at the top, that kind of help at the top and power staying at the top, and a neglect of people at the bottom, then people will begin to lose their civic responsibility. They begin to lose their love for the country. Then you begin to create terrorist groups, home terrorist groups, because they feel like their government, they feel like society, their nation has really forgotten all about them. So all of those things are part of why I wrote the book, to say that our government, our churches, we have to get on another trajectory that will help save our country. Otherwise, we're going to suffer the same fate as the Roman Empire.
It's a paradox to many of us. We know a renowned linguist and philosopher, Noam Chomsky, has spoken about the U.S. no longer being a democracy since it's become an oligarchy in which the hands, in the hands of the few is the whole power is.
Right.
And it's a question too about the ultra-rich elite in the United States.
Yes.
Democracy seems to really deteriorate here.
Exactly. Because when you look at all of the industries and the money makers, wealth is going up. It's not coming down. So all of the people who really making the money in America, the wealth is going up. And the people at the bottom are suffering. I've always been taught like this, that society, you got the people at the top, you got the people at the bottom. And so you have to try to maintain the people at the top, and the people at the bottom, you have to keep them fighting each other. So within that space, you have different class groups. And unfortunately, what is happening at the top is really eliminating the middle class. So now the middle class has fallen down to the lower class. And so, but still the wealth is at the top. And democracy cannot sustain when all of the wealth is going at the top. And then the people at the bottom are hurting. That's not sustainable, because eventually the people at the bottom, even before a boat turns over, it turns over at the bottom. And I'm saying that the people at the bottom are frustrated, they're angry, and so before you know it, the whole boat is going to turn over. It behooves the people at the top to invest in the people at the bottom, invest in the American people again, If you don't do that, it's going to be difficult to sustain what I call this hierarchy. But the people at the top want to maintain this hierarchy. That's why I tell people there's always a difference between making a change and making a correction. The system as it is, the ultra rich on the top, the poor at the bottom, they don't mind making a change, but they're not going to correct those structures. Every correction is a change, but not every change is a correction. You can change the face of something. That don't necessarily mean that you have corrected it. And so therefore, democracy is threatened because you are not saying about the least of these. And that's what Christ encouraged us to do, to see about the least of these. So we're talking about religion. How can we say that we are practicing a true religion or the religion of Christianity when we're forgetting about the poor, when we're forgetting about the elderly, we're forgetting about the sick, we are overlooking the needy? That really makes God angry. And that's when, as one person would say, that's when God rises upon his throne, because of those who are being neglected or crying out to him. So democracy cannot sustain itself. You got to have groups, you got to have classes, you got everybody working in collaboration and cooperation with each other. But when that ceases to be, democracy ceases to be.
And that was the precise problem at the end of the Roman Empire as well. We know the Germanic tribes that finally ended up sacking Rome.
Exactly.
They had been promised land, they had been promised help for their people.
Absolutely.
And they were working almost for free or for little in the German army.
Absolutely.
And the German generals and the Romans at the time, they started keeping their own sons at home.
Yes.
And only sending other people's sons and the foreigners in the land to the army, which was one of the reasons why the Germanic tribes ended up controlling the army in the first place, because they were the ones that were expendable. So there's so many parallels. And then finally the ones sacking Rome actually were the Germanic tribes.
Yes.
And then the ladies, the rich ladies, had to go begging in the street, as St. Hieronymus explains so eloquently from Palestine or Israel.
Exactly.
That he saw the same ladies begging in the street that used to be in the posh orgies and parties and all in Rome.
Can't sustain itself, because people will rebel. If there is a system you want people to participate in, you better make sure that those people have a stake in it. If they feel like they don't have a stake in it, they're going to tear it down. And so that's why we say that democracy is dialogue. We got to communicate. Democracy is people got to pay attention. And when the people at the bottom are paying attention and the people at the top are not paying attention, you got trouble. You're going to have all of these things that deep rumbling at the bottom is going to soon come up to the top. And that's why I say that they're going to start disintegrating within, because the institutions cannot sustain themselves, because the people have lost interest in the institution when they see, if I maintain this institution, it's not good for me, it's good for the people at the top.
And it's a worrisome trend we see in the United States today, pertaining today, because you used to be such a nation of national unity. We used to look up to you in Europe as well.
Exactly.
As the melting pot. And I remember so many Africans that initially came to Europe, then they went on to the States.
Right.
And if you had a high education here, you got a job here at university.
Absolutely.
But now America seems to disintegrate into quite a place of hatred, white against black, woman against man.
Yes. Economically driven, injustice. When I say injustice, I'm talking about economic injustice. Sending jobs to other countries. When you send jobs to other countries, now the people who need the jobs here cannot find work. And so the decisions that are made at the top is hurting people at the bottom. And usually when people don't have income, they can't support their families, they get angry and they have to blame somebody. They may not be able to get to the people at the top, so they start taking out their anger and frustration on the closest people around them. And so this is why you have a lot of killings. This is why you have a lot of racial situations in this country, because one group thinks that the other group is the reason why I'm in this economic system, not understanding that the people at the top are the ones that we ought to be looking at. And we ought to be demanding and participating again in a democracy where we can help form and shape public policies. But if you don't participate in the democracy, when I say participate in democracy, I mean get out and vote, learn the issues, learn who you're putting in there, and then whoever you put in a position or office, then you have to hold those persons accountable. There ought to be some checkpoints along the way. You told us if we would vote for you that you would do this. Have some checkpoints, hold people accountable. But you have to participate in the democracy if you're going to be able to help save a democracy. And so America is showing the same parallels, as we see with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But I guess they're not listening because, they continue.
And in your book, From Wall Street to Main Street, which I suggest for everybody to buy and to read, it's really an excellent analysis. You also speak about secular progressivism. What do you mean by that?
Secular progressivism is, in my opinion, a form of humanism with ostracism or supernaturalism, which simply means that you want to relegate religion. You don't want to have any spiritual or religious influence on anything that you do. So everything now is coming from a humanistic standpoint. You don't have to go outside of the human context, or you don't want to appeal to the Bible, or you don't want to appeal to spiritual things. You want to keep everything purely secular. So I see this as progressive. Secular progressivism is this: you don't want to appeal to no religion, you don't want to discuss it, you want to have nothing to do with God, you want to have nothing to do with prayer, those values that really will help maintain or help to transform a society. You got to have God, you got to have something to appeal to, you got to have a standard in which you reach for, and we call that God. God has a standard for us. But when you decide that you're going to escort God out, and people don't understand, this is one problem we're having. There's not a spiritual discussion in our public discourse. Yeah. People are not talking about the spiritual anymore. That's what I mean when I say secular progressivism. They want to talk about it. And I tell people all the time, God is spirit. Once you escort God out of your nation, out of your policies, out of your thinking, out of your schools and out of your home, that creates a void. And that void will be filled by something. Now, people don't like to talk about this, but there are demons. There are unclean spirits, the Bible will call them, or demons that will fill the void when God has been asked to go out or get out. And so that's why I think a lot of people are giving in to seducing doctrines of demons. Now, they don't know that they're giving in to that, but they are being taught by spirits that are of the devil, and they not even know that that's what they're doing.
Yeah, because it's a strange thing, because when you look at the statistics, around 80% of the American people believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and believe in God. But yet you seem to have such mainstream media that at all times really ridicules a religious faith.
Sure.
And you have situations where when you read the Huffington Post or whatever,
right,
when they speak about spiritual matter, but it seems strange to me, because if we are a democracy and over 80% of the people value spiritual truths, right, and we know how much the Ten Commandments meant in our society,
exactly,
and we know what we don't know what will happen if you remove, don't steal, don't lie,
right,
if it becomes socially acceptable in society that I steal things from you, and that I lie to you about all kinds, envy, for example,
right,
all the sad things that come out of those kind of qualities.
Sure.
It's a question for me, why don't we have that in the mainstream media as an urge for us regular folks to be kind to one another,
right,
and remember not to steal, and
right,
be good to your neighbor, and
right,
take care of the elderly.
Again, we have accepted Whatever people want to do, we find space for that. And I tell people all the time, what you're doing now, you are trying to put the true and living God along with these other gods. And so therefore, people, I say that they've had an orientation in miseducation, or orientation, what I call misreligion. So if you're going to talk about Christ, you can't separate Christ and keep him at home, and then when you go to work, it's something different. No, you have to bring the sacred and the secular together. That's one thing I would say about the Africans when they brought them over here for slavery. They didn't know of a split personality. You know, everything was considered whole. So when we talk about Jesus Christ, then people need to understand who he is, how he operated, and that he was part of the social fabric of his day. We who are Christians must be part of the social fabric. That means that we ought to bring our spiritual beliefs to bear upon the culture. If we don't, then we cannot transform the culture. Then we become what I call cultural Christians. We become part of the culture. A great leader in the African American community and in this nation, Martin Luther King, says that it becomes like the church becomes the tail light rather than the headlight. So we allow society, we allow culture to dictate to us what we ought to say, what we ought not to say. And so therefore we become cultural Christians. Whatever the culture says, that's what we embrace. That's how we want to operate. So if we're going to be transformers of the culture, then we're going to have to bring, as you said, 80% of those people really believe that. They believe it, but there is a separation. They bought into this separation. I don't want to bring my personal beliefs to bear upon the culture. Well, if you don't do that, whoever is creating the culture, they're bringing their personal beliefs. So if you're going to allow other people to form and shape culture, that's part of their personal belief. So we got to get involved and bring our spiritual values on the culture in order to change that culture. But I think that the church is not doing a good job, as it used to do, in helping people to be public witnesses.
The Reverend Billy Graham, whom
Yes.
I so revere, we all know the stories from the 50s and
Yes.
60s and
Yes.
70s, how he worked, and I think he has spoken or preached to 2 billion.
2 billion people.
Something
Yes.
like that. So
Right.
this is really a senior guy.
Right.
And he speaks repeatedly of the U.S. having turned into a Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how he
Yes.
puts it.
Yes.
And he says the moral landslide is just immense, and that
Right.
people need to return to prayer.
Yes. People need to return not only to prayer, but people need to be born again. I think we are living in a time where, people want to hear things that tickle their ear. We're living in time of sexual expression. Whatever I want to express, society said that's fine. And so, as the scripture says, when you sow in the flesh, you're going to reap corruption. But if you sow in the spirit, you're going to reap eternal life. So, but we have turned our nation into this expressive type of nation where whatever you want to do, you live in a country, is free to do it. And I should not criticize you for that, not understanding that boundaries ought to be set. But again, we don't talk about those spiritual values anymore. Billy Graham is exactly right, that when you don't teach the spiritual values, what you do, you allow people to express themselves in fleshly ways. And out of doing that, you bring all kind of troubles for yourself, all kind of problems. And I think it's so unfortunate that was part of the Romans' downfall as well. This sexual expressions, whatever you want to do, that's fine. I'm free to do it. And so if there are no boundaries, if there are no guidelines, if we don't have the Holy Spirit to lead and guide us, to let us know that this is not in line with the will of God, then I think that we also become that Sodom and Gomorrah, and eventually we know what happened to them. God destroyed them. America is on a fast track of being destroyed. Well, how will America be destroyed? I would say that nature is always on the side of God. Nature. And if America or any nation doesn't get its act together and return back to God and morality and standards and spirituality, I really believe that nature, because we're hearing a lot about hurricanes, we're hearing a lot about mudslides, we're hearing a lot about all kind of natural disasters that are happening in the country. That's God is directing nature, trying to get our attention. You need to turn. You need to turn from this. When his chosen nation, Israel, did some of the same things that we're doing today, if God turned his own people, his chosen people, over to nations that didn't know his name, if God scattered them abroad because of their sins, what do we think is going to happen to us? And if God does not punish, if God does not hold us accountable, then God going to have to apologize to all those other nations that meet the consequences of their action.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reginald Davis, for
Thank you.
taking the time and giving us this very serious message.
Yes, yes.
To America and to the West as a whole. And we thank you for joining us here
Thank you.
at the
Thank
Herland
you.
Report.
Yes, glad to be here. Thank you. Yes.